In the tasks section of Amorphium Pro, you'll notice that there is this added palette here to the right, kind of empty palette called tasks. And what this particular palette allows you to do is to be able to record your modeling functions that you do on your object and be able to play them back later on other objects or on the same object, or be able to modify those tests and use them later to see how you've created things. Now, the way you would start doing that is by clicking the little record button here. And so if you don't have a task in there already that you're working with, the very first time you hit record, it's going to ask you to create a file. And what this does is it allows you to actually pick a file first that it's going to save to your hard drive, and it's going to start working on that file on the fly while you're recording. It's going to actually record it to your hard drive. So the nice thing about this is that since it is recording it directly to your computer while you're doing it, if something were to happen, for example, your dog trips over your power cable and your computer goes off, everything you've done has been saved on the fly every time you do it during the tasks, so that you don't lose that file. Your scene, of course, would have to be saved, but to be able to keep your scene information, but at least for tasks, it records it on the fly so that you don't lose that information. So first thing I need to do is give it a name. So I'm going to call this My Tasks. And then I'm going to click Save. Okay, so now once I've done that, you can see that it's got where this is the end of the project, which hasn't, because I haven't recorded anything yet. And you'll see a little red bar above the record button, which is telling me that I am actually recording. So now if I go ahead and start doing things to this object, so for example, if I go into Tools, and I'll go ahead and let's kind of push in on the surface here, and start to kind of sculpt away and say, okay, now I want to use symmetry, and I'll go ahead and maybe pull out with symmetry on the object, and maybe use a different brush. So now, one thing to keep in mind is that while I'm doing this, it's recording everything I do within Tools. Now, in Masks, Materials, Biospheres, Wax, and Composer, it will not record any of those functions. It only records stuff that you do within Tools, Effects, Height, Shop, Morph, Paint, and Mapper. And the reason that is that this is pretty much modifies the actual object itself, as opposed to either world or texture or that sort of thing. It only records things that you do to physically change the object itself. So that's why it only works within these sections. So as long as you do things within those sections, it will record it. So I'll go ahead and do something like in Effects here. Let's go ahead and say, let's do a bottle. Kind of taper off his head a little bit with the bottle tool. And then we'll go ahead and do some paint. I'll say I don't want it to be that light of a blue. We'll make it a little bit darker, and I'll paint some red on there somewhere. Gotta make sure my direction is the right direction. So I'll paint some red. So okay, so now real quickly, now that I've recorded that, if I want to stop, I just hit stop. I could pause my record, but if I hit stop, it actually stops the recording. If I hit pause, it would pause it. Then things that I do wouldn't be recorded, and as soon as I hit record again, it would kick right back into where I was last at. Whereas stop will actually stop the whole process and display everything, and actually you'll be back now at the beginning of what you were working on, and so that now you can play it back onto another object. So now you'll notice that you'll see that all the procedures that I did are now here within the tasks window. So if I undo all the stuff that I did here, so go back to the ball, and if I play this back, you'll actually see it do everything that I just did to this object. Now, One of the interesting things about this is that you can edit these brushes, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. You can actually go in and edit and say, oh, well, I don't like a red, I want that to be a green. You can change that. So for example, if I come in here, I'll go ahead and undo all this. So if I go in, and I believe that was right after the bucket, is the brush here. Actually, I think it was the last brush stroke that I did. So I'm going to go ahead and edit. And there's the red. So I can say, well, I want that more of a green. And click OK. And now, if I play back that whole process, instead of a red being painted there, it will now paint a green on that particular section. So here comes the green right there. So now say, for example, well, I didn't really like the blue back here, so I don't even want that procedure at all. A nice thing is that once you've done something, you can actually say, okay, I want to delete that process. So I can select it, hit delete, and now it won't play the paint bucket of the blue there. Another interesting thing too is say, like, I just want to play back a certain section. Like, I only want to see, you know, these four in here and how that plays back. Well, basically wherever the end is, where you want it to end, you click end, and then wherever you want it to start, let's say right there, you click begin. So now what it's going to do is basically you've picked your begin and end points in your task, and it will gray everything out above and below those sections, so that when you play it, it's only going to play those sections. So there you go. Now that I've done that, I'm just going to go ahead and pick my end here at the end again. I'm going to pick my beginning. So another thing too is, say, for example, the very beginning when I was pushing in on that one particular, like, kind of eye socket kind of, and I'll show you that particular one if I end. Actually, I'll make this the end, the very beginning, the end, so that it only plays back that one. You can see that it actually pushes in on the surface there. Now say that I wanted that to be a bigger radius, but I wanted it to have a higher pressure to actually push in. You can adjust that. It's just a little bit strange because of a few interface issues that have popped up, and I believe some of them are bugs that should be fixed in a future version. But as I edit the pressure and size, you'll notice that these settings here are default settings for every time you use a brush. And even if I had a brush stroke that was really tiny and real low pressure, whenever you open it in the task to edit it, it brings it up as the default settings. Now if I click OK, it's not going to change it to those settings. It's going to leave it the way you had it. To change it, you actually have to checkbox these little checkboxes. Now if I want to say, like, make that radius to be bigger, I'll make it a much larger radius, and maybe make the pressure pretty high so that it will really push in on that surface, so you can see the change that it makes. So I just click OK, and I have to make sure I have those two checked to say that I do want to change those. Once I do that, let me undo this, and now play it back. See, my radius is much higher, and it's actually, my pressure is high too, but because the radius is so high, it didn't seem to push in as much. But I can keep modifying that until I get the desired result that I want. Now you'll notice I open this up again and it's back to 70-35. Well, that's because that's what the default is. Now if I click OK, it's not changing that. It's still doing the one that I did previously. Just for some reason it just doesn't show the actual changes. Now to change it to that, you'd actually have to check these. So I didn't like the fact that my radius was as big as it was, so I'm going to keep it down, kind of a little bit lower, but turn the pressure up, and you'll see what that change does. So it's kind of similar. I can change this and make it even lower size, so it's a little bit more noticeable. Undo that. So now you can see where the change was made. More pressure being pushed in, smaller radius. So just keep that in mind when working with pressure and size in tasks, that it's this kind of weird interface right now, because really the Flux should have it as well, but it doesn't have a checkbox. Then if I adjust the flux down and click OK, now it's been added to it, and if I edit it, it retains the value in the interface, which the other two do not. So it's kind of an inconsistency bug right now, and I'm pretty sure that it will get fixed in future versions. But for right now, that's kind of how you have to work with those particular settings. So I would suggest kind of playing with it until you get the results that you want. So the last thing I'd like to mention is that these two buttons right here. Now, this button's the eject button. What that basically does is it unloads what your current task. Now, it keeps it saved because it's recording it on the fly, because you've given it a name when you first started with it. As soon as you hit eject, it just says, okay, I'm not going to look at that file anymore, and it's now on your hard drive. So if I do that, it gets rid of it. Now, insert is not necessarily an insert, it's more of a load. So if you open your task here with insert, click insert, it brings up this dialog box, you open your file, and it brings it back in. Now, insert, you might think, oh, well, I could open more tasks and stack them here, but you really can't. What it'll do is it'll unload the previous one and load the new one. So think of it more like a VCR, where it's like you're inserting a tape. You can't insert more than one tape, you're just inserting it, and so it's going to go over the top of the one that's there, or it'll eject the one that's there and put in the new one. But that's basically how tasks works. I don't use tasks as much. I'm sure there's a lot of good things you can do with it and run these procedures on other objects, but it just takes some playing with it to get used to it, and it can be very useful. So that's basically how tasks works, and it just takes some playing and getting used to working with it, because there are some interface issues, but with a little bit of time you can actually get some good results and record some steps that you may do a lot, like creating the base of a face that you're going to use to start creating a face, and then be able to play that action back and modify some of the things like the eyes and that sort of thing to get slightly different variations. So it can be very useful. One last thing I forgot to mention until now, and it's basically you can insert recordings in the middle somewhere. So like if I wanted to record something I do to the object somewhere halfway between, I can actually do that by just clicking where I want to insert it. And if I were to select here, it's going to insert it right above it once I do, by just hitting record and doing the particular function. Well, what I would recommend is to actually play those functions first, so you can kind of see what your object is going to look like first. Otherwise, I could record this function and not see really what it's going to do to it until I play the whole thing back, because it'd be somewhere in the middle. So, for example, I could hit, say I'm going to insert right here. What I want to do is actually click the one above where I want to insert it and set that to end. And I'll go ahead and play this. So if I play back that section, it will stop where I last had it set. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can actually come back here and say end, and then select, since I wanted to insert it just above this one, I ended it here, and so now I'm going to select this one and it will insert it right above it. I can now come in and make my change. Actually, I should hit record. To insert it, you basically click the one that you want just below the where you want to insert it, click record. Now if I go to make my change, so for example, if I push in here and then come back and hit stop, you can see it's added that particular change right above it. And actually, since they are both spherical brushes, it's really hard to tell right there, but I'll go ahead and insert another one just so you can see it. I'll insert one above the spherical brush and change to like a smooth brush, and I'll smooth over the edge here and go back into and hit stop. You can see it put the smooth right above it right there, and that's pretty much how tasks works with the task palette.